Public speaking, there are a couple of key elements we need to think about. We need to think about who we're speaking to, the audience, the purpose, the content, and how we're going to deliver that and how we're going to organize it. And so over the next couple of slides, we'll talk about these things. Your audience and purpose. So I put these together on the same slide because they need to go hand in hand. Otherwise, your speech will not land the way you want it to. If you don't understand your audience and you haven't tailored the purpose for that audience, it will not work out. So, when we think about audience, we're going to think about who we're speaking to in particular. And then we're going to consider like who they are, what their interests are, things like that, how we're going to connect with them. And then with our purpose, we'll talk about this again later on in this lecture, but there are three main purposes when we give speeches. There is the informative speech, and that's the idea of when you're speaking to someone and they don't know this information yet and they haven't heard about it. So your purpose in that is to tell them, like, hey, this is out there. This exists. Now, the next purpose is persuasion. And when you're trying to persuade your audience, you are trying to get them to take action. And so instead of just telling them that this problem is out there, this thing is out there, we're telling our audience we need to take action. We need to do this thing. And we're trying to persuade them to take that action. And then the final one is more of a specialized circumstance where it's like a special occasion. And those speeches are a little bit different because we're less focused on informing someone about something or persuading someone to do something. It might be more along a eulogy or a graduation speech when you're talking about like remembering the good times and things like that. That might be a special occasion kind of speech. Let's talk about content. So, when we consider content, we want to focus on things that will be impactful and meaningful to our audience and things that are going to help us build our case. We're looking to put meat on the bones, essentially. Like we're looking for the substance, and that's what we're talking about when it's content. It's like what is going to fill in the bulk of our speech? What are we going to do? And we do that with main points and supporting points under those. And we'll talk about that more later when we look directly at the outline for this upcoming speech. Next is delivery. And in this section, I have included a video about it from a professional speaker when he talks about some of the things like being nervous and how to overcome some of that. But when it comes to delivery, you might wonder, how do I decide on this? How do I talk to my audience? And I think the key here is to vary it. So vary your tone of voice, vary the speed at which you speak, and those things will help make your points more impactful. If you can, when something's really important, if you can slow down and really emphasize it. Or if it's something you really want to just move past, you can talk quickly, you can move right through it. But if you stick with either a slow, middle, or like a fast speed, if you just stick with one of those throughout the whole speech, by the end, it's going to kind of start to feel a bit monotonous. And the same with your tone of voice. If you're sticking to just some mid-range tones, then you're going to start feeling monotone, like you're not going to, and you're going to lull your audience to sleep. But if you can raise your tone, lower your tone, if you can do those things, it will help bring your audience in and help you engage with them. Structure is important when it comes to a speech because with structure, that's how we bring the audience along with us. Because we could talk about all sorts of things, but it might become a jumbled mess and it's hard to follow. But structure is what helps keep our audience on the same page with us. All right. Now, here are some tips to think about when we're preparing a speech. You want to know your audience. You want to know who they are and approach your topic in a way that will connect with your audience. The next is organize your material. So when I'm talking about this tip in particular, I'm talking about your main points and your supporting points under those. What I mean by this is pick and choose carefully the order that you want your main points. So you might start with like your first or your second strongest point, because when it's early on in your speech, you need to grab their attention. Otherwise, you might lose them, or they might never connect with you. And then in the middle, you might have your weakest point. And then so you can move on to your third point being your last and your strongest point, or second strongest, however you want to organize those. So then you can really end strong. And I don't know, it's more impactful instead of just kind of starting strong and then fading away and fading out. But there are reasons why you might organize it so you do fade out. Like with news articles and things like that, it's intentional that you start off really strong, because audiences, especially with news articles and things, if they read anything, they read the first couple lines, and then more of your audience falls off as you go along. With the speech, you want them to hang around until the end and hold their attention until the end. So we probably don't want to organize it that way. I mean, you can in certain situations, but I would recommend ending your speech strong. And next, keep credibility in mind. So there are a couple of ways we're going to build our credibility. One of the main ways we're going to build our credibility is with our nonverbals, with our body language. When we're talking about credibility, or when I'm thinking about credibility, I am thinking about gestures and ways that show us that we're confident about what we're talking about. And we don't want to give contradictory signals, because there are some ways that we can signal with our nonverbal communication with our bodies that show that we're maybe not as confident as we say we are. So a subtle sign of that might be that we're saying, save the forest, save the trees, stop wildfires. But at the same time, if we're not feeling so confident about that and we're subtly shaking our head side to side, we're giving the signal that maybe I don't think this strongly about this as I'm saying I do. And that can kind of undermine your credibility. Some other ways that can undermine your credibility are simple nerves. When you're nervous giving a speech, you might do some behaviors that make it seem like you're antsy, like you're not quite sure, and that might come across as, instead of you being nervous being in front of an audience, you might be less certain about the subject material you're speaking about. Now, the other main idea with credibility is content related. You want your content to be believable. Like we talked about in a previous chapter, we talked about critical listening. And among those things we talked about is your audience is going to be engaged in some critical listening. So you want to go through those same ideas, like, is what you're saying plausible? And you want to kind of check off those boxes and get your audience on board with you. Now, it's okay to challenge some ideas with your credibility. But if you go too outlandish, then you're going to lose your audience as you go along. All right, the next tip is practice your delivery. And there are a couple of ways that practice can really benefit before you're giving a speech. Some of those might include pacing. And when you practice your delivery, you're able to prepare and be able to anticipate how your speech is going to go so you can make the main point you want to get across more impactful. It also, one of the main reasons to practice your delivery and how you're going to give your speech is it helps manage those nerves. You can go through it, and so it's one less thing you're worrying about when you're out in front of people giving a speech. All right, the next thing is eye contact. When we're giving a speech, eye contact is one of those nonverbals that can really impact your credibility. If you can't look out at your audience, they're gonna think maybe you're not so sure about these ideas, not so sure about what you're trying to say. And so when we're giving a speech, eye contact is important. And I don't mean just like death glare staring at your audience the whole time. But what I mean is I don't want, unless it's intentional, you shouldn't be just outright reading the speech, looking down at, you want to make eye contact with your audience. And so what I recommend, especially with a speech for this class, is using 3x5 cards with the highlights, the things, the landmarks, you might say, the things that if you're on a road trip, the things like, oh, when I get to this point, then I do that. The things that'll keep you on track and go in the right direction. That's what should be on your 3x5 cards. When you've practiced your delivery, when you know your speech pretty well, you should be able to give your speech glancing occasionally at your 3x5 cards and be able to make good eye contact with your audience. All right. And now the final two tips are to use your voice effectively. And when we're talking about using your voice, there are a couple of ways that we can interpret that. So one way you might interpret it as use your voice effectively is as an individual, like your voice, what your thoughts, what your opinions are, get those across. The other way is more literal, and that's like your actual voice, like the sound coming out of your mouth. And we can use both of those effectively to help us get our ideas and get our audience on board with what we're saying. And finally, care about your subject, be passionate about it. Because if you aren't passionate about your subject material, why should your audience care about it? All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, like we talked about before, there are 3 types of speeches. We've got the informative speech, which we have for this class. Then the next type is persuasive, and then finally the third one is special occasions. So to illustrate these, I'd like to share an example with you guys. So let's say we want to give a speech about I-70 and going from just south of Ephraim down there by Richfield and Salina all the way over through Colorado. So if we were giving an informative speech about I-70 from Richfield all the way into Colorado, we might want to talk about all of the beautiful things you see along the way, because the audience might not be aware that you go up over the Rocky Mountains, that you go through these beautiful red rock canyons along the way, that you can see things as beautiful as you might see in any national park just driving down I-70. And with informative, we are laying out that these things are there. You might not have known that they were there, but there are these amazing things out there. Now, if we were to give a similar speech, but with our purpose being to persuade our audience, we would instead approach it as, you need to get in the car. You need to go down there and drive to Colorado Springs. And there are these amazing things you're going to experience along the way. And you need to get in the, like, you need to do it. That is the difference with persuasive to informative. And with a special occasion, we might instead give a speech about remembering that road trip we took down I-70 when we stopped and we saw all these beautiful lookout points, looking out for miles and miles, the beautiful, beautiful vista. Yeah, so those are kind of the different types of speeches. So most of the speeches we'll give, though, will fall into the informative and persuasive categories. And so we'll talk about more speech stuff on the next slide. All right, speech preparation. There are four main levels of speech preparation I want to talk about. The first is impromptu. Now, that would be you walk into a room, they give you a topic, and you've got 2 to 5 minutes to think up some main ideas and some supporting points for your speech. And so that's the quick and dirty. It's like you kind of want to follow the same organization as you would with a more prepared speech, but you don't have a lot of time to fill in the details, to fill in the gaps. And so it's more about the main ideas and the supporting details you can fit in there on the fly. The second level of speech preparation is extemporaneous. And so this is the next level of being fleshed out, and it's my personal favorite way to prepare a speech. So it'd be like we prepared a speech directly from our outline. So we've gone through the introduction, have planned a way to get their attention, to get their goodwill, a thesis statement. We know our main points, we know our subpoints and our supporting details, and we're going to just go from each of those and fill in the details as we go, like flesh it out as we go. The next level of preparation is when we write out the entire speech, and that's what we're talking about with a manuscript. We word for word write out our entire speech. And the temptation when you have a manuscript prepared for a speech is to read the entire thing. And it is not my favorite way of delivering a speech, because when you have a manuscript for a speech, you have the tendency that you want to look down. You want to just keep your eyes on the page and just like you're reading from a textbook, read everything word for word. And so a manuscript is great, especially to help you fully realize those ideas you have. But if you're going to go to the trouble of doing a manuscript, I would encourage you to continue on and go to the next step, which is memorized. And so after you have written out your entire speech, the next level is to memorize it, to commit it to memory in a way that you can essentially give it from memory with very little outside help. So with a memorized speech, you'd be able to cover all of your points with minimal support from like 3x5 cards for reference, like to your main points and some of your supporting points to help keep you on track with a memorized speech. Now, when you're giving a speech in a presentation, oftentimes it is with a slideshow or with something at your back, some kind of presentation. So what kind of things do you want in a slideshow? And what kind of things do you want to avoid? When it comes to a slideshow, you want your slides to be relatively simple. You don't want paragraphs and paragraphs of small text on there, because if you get your audience to start reading something like that, they are going to keep reading it, and it's going to be hard for you to get them to go back to what you're saying instead of focus on what they're reading. And so to set yourself up for success, you don't want really complex information-filled slides filled in like paragraph form. Things that should be on slides is information that would be hard to describe verbally, but is pretty simple when laid out visually. So like graphs and charts and things like that are more impactful in a visual medium instead of a verbal medium. Something that to consider adding in a slideshow is a blank slide or just a black slide in between the slides where you have something to talk about. So the benefit to doing a blank slide like that is that you can have a slide where you're discussing something, and then you can switch to a blank slide. So then your audience isn't still staring at whatever interesting visual thing you've put up there. Instead, it turns their focus back to you. And so there are some other tips and tricks and ideas with slideshows, but the idea is you want to make it easily readable, so a decent size font so your audience isn't struggling to read, and not so much that it takes them more than about 7 seconds to read whatever it is that you've put up there. All right. This is the end of this lecture. I look forward to seeing your speeches and seeing what you've prepared. Thank you.